Alright, we've got perfectly aligned reference images. We're ready to get from nothing at all to this moment here where we're sculpting details onto our character. And most of the work at this point is still about developing fluency with this tool. We'll focus on the artistry after we've become fluent. See if you can find your 3D cursor. It's this red and white life ring. It's the spot at which new objects are going to appear, and if you accidentally held down Shift and right-clicked, you might have repositioned the 3D cursor somewhere off in space. So let's send it back to the origin. Press Shift S to bring up the snap menu and choose cursor to world origin. That'll snap it back to the world origin here where the X and Y axes cross, the red and the green line, such that all new objects appear at the origin of the world. Good, then press Shift A to bring up the add menu and choose Mesh Icosphere. An icosphere is a sphere made up of triangles. The vertices are evenly spaced across its surface. It's a good starting object for sculpting. So select it, grab it with the G key and place it somewhat near the character. Then press the S key and start scaling it smaller and bigger, and as you do, watch a couple important details. Watch how the scale values for X, Y, and Z get bigger and smaller, and if you can't see them, press the N key on your keyboard and click on this Item tab. And as you're playing with the scale, notice how we're playing with the scale in object mode. The key detail is that when you're sculpting, you really need your scale values to be 1, 1, and 1 on X, Y, and Z. Any other values are going to mess up your sculpting brushes. Okay, but what if I need this sphere to be smaller so as to match my character? How do I do that without messing up my sculpting brushes? Well, first go ahead and scale the sphere to be about the size you want. Here I've scaled it down on Z and scaled it up on Y to match my character. Then just glance over at your scale values to see that they're no longer 1, 1, 1. Then press Command A to apply the scale. This will keep your object the size of your character, but reset your scale values to be 1, 1, 1. Good, check your first object from front view to make sure that it's the right size there too, and then add another icosphere. Shift A, add mesh icosphere. Take this second sphere and scale it down to be the head of the character. And yes, you could sculpt this out of a single sphere, but I want to talk about multi-object sculpting because it's so often so useful. Okay, when you got two spheres, make sure to have hit Command A to apply the scale of both. Then select the big one and hit Control Tab to change modes into sculpt mode. You'll see a ton of brushes down here. Don't worry, we are only going to use a couple, and we're going to start with the draw brush. Left click and drag on your sphere and see that you can start drawing out the vertices. Left click on the vertices of the head and notice how they don't change. That's a separate object. Hit Command Z to undo the sculpting we did on the body, and then middle click to orbit the view to see how the sculpting that we do is currently asymmetrical. It's only happening on one side of the character. So come on up here and click on the X button to turn on X-axis symmetry. Now notice how if I sculpt on one side of the character, the vertices on the other side are drawn out as well. Symmetrical sculpting is really useful. It lets us work twice as quickly, and we can still add asymmetry to our characters later on. Good, now let's talk about remeshing our object. Remeshing is a powerful tool that makes digital sculpting possible. It's one of the tools that gets messed up if your scale values aren't 1, 1, 1. To start remeshing, you just hit the R key and notice this grid pop up. And as you slide your mouse cursor back and forth, left and right, notice how the grid squares get smaller or bigger. What you're doing is you're saying, hey Blender, please project a three-dimensional version of this grid through the object I've got. And wherever my object happens to cross one of these intersections on these grid lines, please give me a new vertex there. And so if you set your grid to be very large, you're going to get just a few vertices when you remesh. You might lose a bunch of detail that you care about. And if you set your grids to be teeny, 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 then you're going to get millions of vertices. You might get far more than you can handle at that moment. And so choosing the size of this remesh grid is critical. For now, let's set ours to have a grid intersection every 0.178 meters. Then left-click to accept this number and press Command-R to remesh. Good, then look at this before and after. Before, we had the triangles of our icosphere. After, we have far more vertices and a little bit of resemblance to those triangular flats, but more of a rounded shape. Good. With this shape, switch to your grab brush, press the F key, and slide your mouse to the right to make the grab brush influence window bigger, then left-click to accept it, and left-click and drag many times to start scooting the vertices towards the outline of our reference imagery. Then switch to front view and do the same to match the reference image from the front. Just know that from this view, because we are making a perfectly symmetrical 3D object, you're going to have to pick a side. You won't be able to match both sides of your imperfect reference imagery, your asymmetrical reference imagery, and that's okay. Then switch to top view and do the same thing. Good. Come back to right view, make sure you haven't messed anything up in the process, and now focus on the head of the character. And you might remember that we can't sculpt the head of the character yet because it's a different object. So, to quickly switch objects from sculpt mode on one to sculpt mode on the other, hover your mouse over the object you want to switch to and press Option Q or Alt Q. When you do, Blender will make the new object flash red for a moment to indicate that that's your sculptable object. Good. Now repeat the process. Press R and slide your mouse to choose a size for your remesh grid, then press Command R to remesh, and then sculpt until the head of the character matches the body of the character. And as you go, you might be thinking, well, there's this ugly seam that forms. Why aren't I making the entire character out of a single blob? And you could, but there are many occasions, and we're going to see one in the next chapter, where it's just so much easier to sculpt with multiple objects. So I want to get a bit of practice here. Good. When you've gone as far as you can with the body and the head, come back to the body, Option Q, watch it flash red, and then set your remesh grid to be more fine. I'm going to pick a value about 0.067. I want more vertices per meter than I used to have. And then press Command R to actually perform the remesh. Then switch to your draw brush, hit F and slide your mouse cursor to make the draw brush smaller, and draw on the surface, and notice how with more vertices, I can make more fine details. And you might be thinking, why not just skip to the fine detail level immediately? Why bother with the lower density sculpting pass? Well, sculptors across the world in real media and digital media find over and over again that you just don't get very far if you move on to the details too soon. You've got to build up the big forms, and those are easier to do in digital sculpting with a lower density mesh. Once the big forms of your character look pretty good, then it makes a bit of sense to move on to the details. Okay, we've got the draw brush, but the first thing that I want to do with it is not actually draw. I want to smooth. And so hold down the Shift key and then left click and drag. And yes, you'll have the draw brush selected, but you'll be smoothing with it. Good. Now Option Q to switch into the head, and notice that we made a mistake. The head is asymmetrical. It's a separate object, and each object needs to have this symmetry across X turned on individually. Okay, but do I have to start over now on the head, or can I make this asymmetrical head symmetrical? Click on the Tool tab and open up this box down here under Symmetry, and look for this button that says Symmetrize, and notice the direction drop down. I want to force symmetry from positive X to negative X. My clue is up here in the navigation gizmo from the letter X to the empty red ball, because I want this blob on the side of my character to be forced over onto the other side. And then if I click the actual Symmetrize button, it'll happen. Great, symmetrical, but yikes, what a horrific sight to behold. So let's get this alien brain smoothed out by using the draw brush, hold down Shift to use smooth mode, and get the now symmetrical shape to better match the actual shape of the character. And I also want to talk about how there are stages of the sculpting journey where the sculpture looks absolutely horrific. Sometimes this is because you're learning, and sometimes it's just because you're in the middle of the project and you're not yet done putting on the final, lovely, and rather easy finishing touches. This is the hard part and the most important part. Yeah, but what about that seam? Are we really supposed to have an ugly seam in the middle of a character that clearly has no seam right there? Eventually, no. So let's fix it. Now's the appropriate time. But first conceive of what's actually happening. Come on up here and change your drawing mode from solid to wireframe so that you can see through these meshes. In wireframe mode, we can clearly see that we have two totally separate intersecting objects, thus the ugly seam. As a step towards fixing it, switch back to solid view so that you can see this a little more clearly, and change from sculpt mode back to object mode. I want to join these two objects together so that they are no longer separate. To do so, select the head of the character, and then hold down Shift and select the body. Then come on up to the Object menu and choose Join, so that they are joined together as one. Okay, but if we switch back into wireframe mode, we can see that there's still this gross intersection. So how do we make that go away? Well, that is one of the other superpowers of the Remesh tool. Switch back into Sculpt mode, and then hit R to set a remesh grid size, and then Command R to remesh, and just like that, the intersection is gone. The seam is much reduced, and with a little bit of smoothing, it can go away entirely. Now I'm back to just using the draw brush and the grab brush, and holding down Shift to smooth in order to finish the shape of this character. This part of the journey feels like the fun part. It's easier, it's more rewarding. The character goes from looking pretty good to looking better and better and better with each stroke that I make. To the point where we can even talk about sculpting these areas where the character will put out its new leaves. And it's a good chance to talk about our final brush, the crease brush. Go ahead and select it here and use it to make sharp creases in your characters. Good, add a couple more of these dimples and then let's call this character done. Learning to sculpt takes practice, and this warm-up should get you ready for the more complex character to come, the bust of the dog.